Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Barbara McHugh, who's here to share with us her new novel, The Bride of Buddha. So Barbara is a published poet and novelist with many years of professional experience editing fiction, newsletters, and technical documents. She has an MA in English Literature from NYU and a PhD in Religion and Literature from the University of California at Berkeley. Barbara is a successful writing coach, book doctor, and has been co-teaching workshops and intensives since 1994. So welcome to the show, Dr. Barbara McHugh.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
What an honor it is to have you here to talk about your new book. I was floored when I saw this book, and I could see why it's getting such great reviews. It's just so well written. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I knew of many women who were turned off by the idea of the leader of a major religion being a person who deserted his wife and child. And I think even when I started practicing Buddhism, I had my reservations too. So there was always this question hovering in the background. And I wanted to understand that story more deeply, and I wanted to understand it from the wife's point of view. Because I did begin to understand why that myth was important in Buddhism, why he had to leave this wonderful family, as opposed to it being just some kind of a dissolute person who was tired of wine, women, and song. No, he had a wife and baby, and he loved the wife very much, and he was in patriarchy. He had a son. I mean, why would you leave such a great life? And I think the whole idea around the myth then is that the best life has suffering in it. The best life ends in death, and Buddha wants to find out how to alleviate this suffering. And so that starts him on his journey. But still, I was haunted by the wife's point of view, because she was still left behind with a little boy, or the baby, actually, 2 days old. And so what was her story? So that's what started me with it.
Yeah, it's kind of the untold story is what you're really kind of diving into here. And a lot of people have this question. It's like, okay, well, we know Buddha went and, found enlightenment. But what did happen to his family? Like, how did they even manage after he was gone?
Well, he was a fairly well-off person. And, he was in an extended family. They lived with the in-laws. The myth is that he was a prince in a palace to continue with this idea of the perfect life. Actually, he was probably the son of a clan leader, of a clan who was a vassal to yet another kingdom. So he wasn't really a prince in a palace, but he was well off. So he wasn't leaving this poor woman on the roadside with the baby. She was her physical needs were going to be taken care of. So that wasn't a problem. But the problem was the loneliness and the bitterness and the disappointment of suddenly being alone with this child and having to bring him up. And in the early suttas, and that's where I get most of my story and most of my inspiration, the early scriptures of the Buddha. The Buddha's wife is hardly mentioned at all. She's mentioned at one point where the Buddha returns after his enlightenment 7 years later, and she introduces him to her son by saying to her son, "There's your father, go get your inheritance." And that's all we hear from her. And, scholars like Karen Armstrong say, well, this person was really bitter, this woman, this wife. And she didn't enjoy leaving her, deserting her son or having her son be brought up by the Buddha as a monk. But we don't hear anything more from her. Now, there's a tradition afterward that she joined the Sangha later, and there was another story about her that she was actually pregnant for 6 months, the whole time that 6 years. She was pregnant for 6 years, the whole time the Buddha was seeking his enlightenment. And that was obviously a myth. And I have my Yasodhara deal with that in the novel. She says, that was a rumor, and it's not true, thank God.
Oh, thank God is right. Yeah. I don't think anyone wants to have that kind of experience. And, your book is so well written. We want to do it justice. Of course, we want people to pick up their own copy of The Bride of Buddha. Why don't you share a little bit about the story with us? I know you've been kind of diving into it with us already, but is there anything else you'd like to share?
Oh, yeah, I can sort of give sort of a vague summary of the book. It starts out with a prologue where the Buddha is leaving. And she says to him, she says at the end, he was taking the journey that I planned for myself. And in my book, as a child, she has a traumatic experience when her sister dies accidentally and she blames herself. And she ends up going to the charnel ground, trying to find her sister's spirit and discovering to her horror that she can't see any spirits, just these dead bodies. So in some ways, she has the same kind of existential experience about death at age 10 that the Buddha has at age 29. And she decides at age 10 that she's going to be, a holy wanderer, because these were times in which being a holy wanderer, homeless, wandering around begging for alms and talking about deep subjects, that was considered a heroic type of career. I mean, it was respected. And she decided to do it, even though women generally didn't do it. There were women who did it. However, her family had other ideas for her. She was going to be married. And through a long process, she is married and ends up being married to Siddhartha, who later becomes the Buddha. And at first, she doesn't want to marry him at first, but I will not give you too many spoilers here. She ends up being fairly happy with him until she gets pregnant, and he begins to have his existential crisis and goes off and leaves her. So she ends up trying to deal with everything. Her son comes back. The Buddha returns from his enlightenment, and her son, who's now a boy of about 7, wants to become a monk. And she doesn't want him to, but he does. And at that point, and there are lots of reasons why she decides to do this in the book, she goes off and has her own spiritual adventures, only to return to be with the Buddha, understanding that her real destiny is to join his Sangha, only to learn that his Sangha doesn't admit women. So she disguises herself as a male and enters the Sangha as a monk, and later becomes the monk's, the Buddha's attendant, Ananda, this is very historical. And the reason I made this choice was that there are a lot of things about Ananda that are fascinating and feed right into a story that he could be a woman in disguise. He was always very, very on the side of women. He was the monk who talked the Buddha into admitting women into the Sangha. And so obviously this is what Yasodhara is going to have to do. I won't explain. The book does explain how she manages to pull this off, to disguise and talking the Buddha into things. But anyway, that's sort of the gist of the story. And then it follows along with her life in the Sangha. And one of the things I learned from my research about the Buddha early Sangha and from the early Pali Canon was there was this polarization in the canon between the very strict ascetics and followers who are not such strict ascetics. More people that were interested in love and connection and community. And what does this mean in terms of Buddhism and in terms of any religion? And I really became sensitive to that polarity in all religions, that there's that, you could call it the polarity between love and wisdom. And in Buddhism now, they talk a lot about wisdom and love, as wisdom and compassion as the two wings of the Dharma. And you can't have one without the other. The Dharma cannot fly without wisdom and compassion. So there's this polarity, and Ananda is on one side of it, and then there are monks on the other side that are fighting against him/her. And the story proceeds from there to the climax of the Buddha's death and what happens to Ananda afterward.
It's just so fascinating. And the book is even better when you dive in. There's so many twists and turns and very interesting things. When you were doing your research for this book, I know there was so little on his wife. Was there anything that surprised you?
Well, partly these anomalies about Ananda, that here was an unenlightened junior monk who talks the enlightened leader of the Sangha into admitting women. And so like, this is a man who must have known all of Ananda's arguments, which were rather simple, the way it's stated in the Sangha. It's basically, how can you reject women when your stepmother is one of them, the stepmother who nursed you from the time you were a baby? How can you reject women? But the Buddha does 3 times before he finally says yes. But this anomaly just strikes me, well, this is strange. And then the other anomaly about Ananda is that even though he's the Buddha's attendant, he does not become enlightened until after the Buddha's death, which is very strange because the Buddha was surrounded with enlightened monks. I mean, there was even a mass murderer who becomes enlightened as a monk. I mean, he doesn't stay a mass murderer, a former mass murderer who comes into the Sangha and becomes enlightened. And of course, the Buddha's chief disciples are enlightened. So why not Ananda? So one explanation would be, well, because Ananda is leading a life of deception, and that has to be dealt with before he can reach enlightenment, or she can reach enlightenment. And but their relationship enables Ananda to talk the Buddha into admitting women too, and that factors in. So that surprised me. And learning too, what surprised me also about this struggle in the early Sangha, that it was a very powerful struggle, I think. And it was really embodied by these various monks. On the other side was the monk Devadatta, who figures into my novel too, who was a super ascetic, and he wanted all the monks to obey the super ascetic rules, wear only rags, never stay under a roof, stay out under the forest, be strictly vegetarian. And he had a whole list of things. And the Buddha said to him, look, the monks can do this. They're perfectly allowed to do this, but they don't have to. They just have to follow the monastic precepts the way they're set out. So eventually, Devadatta left the Sangha, and then there are all kinds of stories about how he tried to kill the Buddha. So some of these are in my novel too, and his relationship to Ananda, which is not friendly, is in the book.
And so many twists and turns. My goodness. Was it difficult to write all these characters, or did they just come alive for you as you were writing?
There were certainly difficult spots. All of a sudden you just, wait a minute. I mean, some of them I really enjoyed trying to picture the Siddhartha before he became enlightened. What type of a person would he be? And I saw him as a kind of a very progressive person for his time, even though there really was no concept of social progress back then. But I mean, he wanted to make sure that all of his servants got time off and was treated well. And, he was one of the, an ideal kind of liberal in his day. And also he was in denial about death. I mean, the myth about the Buddha is that his parents, because at the Buddha's birth, a holy man predicted that he would either become a great monarch or a great holy man. And his father, of course, wanted him to become a monarch. So he decided, okay, I'm going to block off any signs of death, old age, and sickness so that my son won't be tempted to become a holy man to deal with this. So in the myth, that's what he does. And in the myth, the Buddha has no idea about death until he's 29 years old, which of course is silly or psychologically impossible. But I took that myth and thought, well, the father certainly could have, toned down all the signs of death. He could make sure that most of the Buddha's attendants were youthful, and hide the charnel ground, have a woods between the palace and the charnel ground, have the charnel ground way, way out of town, hide the hospital, so that the Buddha lived in this kind of denial of death. So I had him do that, and then I had him relate to his young wife and how, and show his love for life as she loves life. And then he has to face that existential crisis. And then after he became enlightened, that's when it gets sticky to, put words in the mouth of an enlightened master. As much as I could, I used what he said in the suttas. But obviously between the scenes where he's interacting with Ananda, where she's Yasodhara, where they're in private, I have to make up the dialogue. So that was a challenge, but I just tried to just open myself to what the ultimate truth that could come through me. Whether, however flawed it was, I just had to be open, and I had to do it that way.
Well, you did such a beautiful job, and it's easy to see why you're getting the great reviews that you're getting, because it flows so beautifully. And it has me kind of thinking, when you were, bringing everything together, did you write it in segments and then pull it together, or is it something that just flowed out of you?
How I wish it just flowed out of me. I wrote it fairly chronologically. I had a very, very rough outline of where it wanted to go. It's funny now because my memories of it, it's long enough ago. I think, well, what actually did happen? Because at first I hadn't intended to do the gender switch. I just, but it became more and more compelling because I was continuing to do research as I was writing the book. And I just thought, and then it just had to happen. So I sort of went chronologically. I also work with a critique group, which are wonderful people, blessed beings who are so helpful, putting it through the critique group. And where do you think this is, falling down? Where is it standing up? And they're great. I've worked with them for decades, and it's a very diverse culturally and racially group, and it's just marvelous. And religiously, everybody has different, from secular to conservative Judaism to almost fundamentalist Christianity. We have a very great diversity and this is only 4 people.
Well, it's great to have those kind of diversities, and you're bringing so many different voices to the table. And I'm kind of thinking, a lot of people who maybe don't know about Buddhism or are new to Buddhism, this novel, I think, would help kind of outline a little bit about what Buddhism is like.
That's what I'm hoping. That's one of the purposes, just is to give people a sense of Buddhism and the Dharma so they could check it out on their own if they don't, and sort of, because I really feel that right now Buddhism is important in this culture and in the West and worldwide, really, for what it has to say to people, and how to have people begin to learn, all of us begin to learn more about our own minds and how our own mind works. And I think Buddhism, of all the religions, does this the best. I'm not saying it's the best religion. I'm just saying that's its area of expertise. I think all religions do this, and other religions have other areas that are strong. And I am one of the things that I think I learned as I was reading this book was writing this book was getting a deeper appreciation of all religions and how they all seem to address this idea of we need to break out of the prison of ourselves. Self-centeredness is really the root of suffering and pain and evil. And we really need to truly understand what that means and truly begin to go beyond it.
And even in a societal level, you look at, how women are being kind of in many ways discriminated against in their struggle for liberation and enlightenment.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to do, was write like an empowering book, write a kind of book where the woman is at the center of the story. It's not the Buddha story seen through the wife's eyes. It's her story. She's at the center of facing these questions on her own. I like to think of gender as something that characterizes a person. It doesn't define a person. So that when you think of a person, you don't automatically think of a man. That the default person is not a male. And I've learned, when I think of Ananda, honestly now, Ananda comes through much stronger than whether male or female. And without taking away the sex or making it asexual. Although sometimes monastics, at least Buddhist monastics, I've heard them refer to themselves as a third gender.
Well, yeah, I can understand that, because isn't the Buddha, they look at him at one point, he's so enlightened, it's, both male and female energies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that these super ascetics that appear in the book and that still are around are very, very often macho, and there is this contempt toward women. But they also look at, the problem of love. The problem of love. The Buddha says a couple of things that are interesting quotes. And one of them is, if you have 100 loved ones, you suffer 100 times more. The Buddha says this. But the Buddha also says, as a mother would risk her life to protect her child, her only child, even so should one cultivate a limitless heart with regard to all beings. So he really raises the bar with love, but he warns people about being preferential toward love. You really need to learn to expand your heart, beginning perhaps with the people that you love, but then expand that love to include all beings. And that's one of the big struggles that my protagonist has, because she loves her son, and who has become a monk, and she has to live with him without him knowing that who she is. She has to live in that community, but she has to learn to expand that love. And she needs to struggle with that. And it's not that I have any pat formula to resolve that polarity, but there's one quote I sometimes recite to myself that a lot of Buddhists use, and it's, wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I'm everything. My life is a river that flows between the two. And to me, well, that's sort of getting to this, somehow putting together these two, in some ways, opposites, or two complements, love and wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love those quotes, because it really is asking for us to reach further in what we perceive love. And I think a lot of times people don't go beyond their boundaries of their family.
Yeah. And this becomes, in a sense, a sort of a super egoism, because you identify with this finite group, and then you are locked into that. And it's that constant. One of the things that the Buddha says is life is constantly changing, and all of the parts of the self that we identify with are in constant flux. Your body dies, your mind changes, your heart changes, everything. And so the self is a mystery. And that's expanding in that love is, there are no words to sort of neatly tie everything up. You have to live it.
Well, and you've been practicing Buddhism for some time, I understand.
Yeah, we really started in the 80s. I was sort of one of those people that bounced around from guru to guru for a while, having been brought up. My mother was a very anti-Catholic Episcopalian, and my father was a Catholic, very strong Catholic who didn't believe in God. So they really argued constantly and fought a lot about this. So I grew up kind of skeptical, and then trying to resolve some of the experiences I'd had religiously, and bounced around, and finally came to Buddhism. And then I think the last 20 years or so, I started doing 2 or 3 residential retreats a year, and doing a lot of practice. and I still have a practice. I don't do as much meditating as I used to, but I still meditate. I know I meditated for a while for like an hour or two a day, and I still sometimes get up to an hour, but I don't do it as often for various reasons, and it just may be a trough in the wave. I'm not sure. But I have I have a loving kindness practice, which I practice every day. And I have various mindfulness practices, which I do during the day. So I keep up the practice. I think it's getting me somewhere. my teacher says, when people say, well, I've been going on all these retreats and I'm doing all this stuff and I'm still I'm still getting depressed and fighting with my sister. And then my teacher would say, ask yourself, are you doing less harm? And I think when I look back, I think I am doing less harm to other people and even to myself. But I still have a long, long, long way to go.
And don't we all? I mean, practicing loving kindness every day, it sometimes can be a little challenging, even, trying to find time to do a meditation practice.
Yeah.
And I love how you really incorporate your experiences of Buddhism in many ways. You bring that love into the book. You can feel it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, the loving kindness practice I practice is like a meditation. I go through a long, long list of people, and I wish them to be safe, happy, healthy, and free. And they're phrases I repeat. That's the short version of the phrase. Sometimes I repeat longer phrases. And I really try to have the person in my heart when I'm doing it. And I found over the last couple of years, because this has been a growing practice with me, that it's really made a difference in terms of how I see people. And again, it goes back to the idea of not reducing them to their gender or their looks or their accomplishments, or even whether I like them or not. There's a whole new mystery that evolves. So that practice is probably right now the practice that I feel is doing the most for me.
I was going to ask what you thought some of the themes of the book are, and that sounds like that's it, is really kind of looking at people as they are. I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, that is. I think one of the main themes of my book, again, is resolving this polarity between trying to transcend the world and deal with mortality and try to love the world. How do we hold these two opposites? That everyone we love and everyone and us, they're all going to die. And how do we escape the crushing pain of that, and at the same time still be able to love and be for our loved ones and for the world? And that's something I'm always trying to hold, and that was my protagonist's struggle, because she was very much in love with the world. And there's a whole section where she visits the hill people, and she meets a woman who's a shaman, and seeing that earth love and the love for the non-human. And I wanted to incorporate that into my book as well, that it's not just the household world or the home world, but the entire world, the physical world, life. And what is that all about? At the same time, there's this idea that you go beyond words, you go beyond everything, and you certainly go beyond the world. So that is the struggle that she is engaged in throughout the book, and her values are tested through the conflicts and struggles that she has. I mean, she has to learn forgiveness as well as everything else. And that's another theme in the book for me. I mean, she not only has to forgive the Buddha for deserting her, and realizing sometimes she thinks she's forgiven someone, and then she realizes she really hasn't. And that comes up again and again. And her final resolutions have to do with forgiveness.
And don't we go through that too? I know, work on forgiveness and get to this point. It's like, oh yeah, I forgive this person. And then all of a sudden it comes up and you're like, gosh, I still got to work on this. And I feel like your book really challenges us in many different ways, how we look at the world, how we view the world, how we view love, how we view one another. And I was just so impressed with your book, Barbara.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You asked me if, how did I enjoy writing it? In some ways, I really did enjoy writing it. I mean, it was because there was a lot of my struggle in it, I guess. And to be able to have these characters help me out. And some of them did. They just seemed to help me out. I mean, some of the characters just were there, and I sort of I could mold them to some extent, but they had what they needed to say, and they would say it. And so I really felt, that I had to just channel things.
Well, you did a beautiful job with that. My goodness. I mean, it was such a profound book, and I could see why it's getting the great reviews that it is. Barbara, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your book and be part of your community?
Well, the best place is to start is my website, which is BarbaraMcHugh.com.
Barbara, thank you so much for taking the time to do a show with us here today.
Thanks. My books are on sale at local. You can order them from local bookstores or, of course, on Amazon or any other, places where books are sold.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new novel, The Bride of Buddha. The Bride of Buddha is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And remember, support our indie bookstores. If you'd like to connect with Barbara, you can at her website, Barbara McHugh, and that's spelled MCHUGH.com. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.